The news broke in the dead of night, its message an icy whisper through the Terran communication networks. Cyrillus Prime, one of humanity's finest colonies on the fringes of explored space, had simply vanished. No warning, no distress signal. It was as if it had never existed. For days, Fleet Command could not reach Cyrillus. In the silence, speculation turned to fear. But when the scout ship Vanguard arrived at Cyrillus coordinates, the truth was far worse than anyone had imagined. A vast, thriving colony, once home to millions of scientists, farmers, engineers, and families, had been completely erased. The atmosphere was gone, its once vibrant sky replaced with a dead, ashen expanse. Cities were not destroyed. They were wiped from existence, as though a giant hand had swept them away. Towers that had stood for decades were now nothing more than rubble, scattered across a barren wasteland. The colony was gone. Not a single survivor, not even a trace of humanity remained. Images and data flooded Fleet Command's command center on Earth. The bright blue oceans, once so rich with life, had been turned into an empty, lifeless expanse of dry dust. Terran satellites, already in orbit, picked up faint signals that would only confirm the horror. The destruction wasn't caused by a bomb or a catastrophic natural event. It was a precision strike, something deliberate, something that had come from a force far beyond humanity's grasp. Admiral Elias Rourke stood at the helm of the Terran fleet's command center, his face ashen as the reports came in. He had spent most of his life on Cyrillus, watching the colony grow from a small, fragile settlement into a shining beacon of Terran ingenuity. The loss wasn't just political or military, it was deeply personal. The colony had been his home, and now it was gone. His eyes were locked on the holofeed, seeing the destruction with his own eyes, even as his mind rejected it. The pain of the news was overwhelming, but beneath it, a simmering rage began to boil. For a moment, there was silence in the command center. The room, usually filled with the soft hum of machinery and the low murmur of strategists, felt suffocatingly still. Then, Fleet Command's voice cut through the quiet. Admiral Rourke, we have confirmed that the Velari Dominion has been active in this sector. We suspect their involvement. The mention of the Velari Dominion sent a ripple of shock through the room. The Velari had been known for their brutal expansionism, wiping out weaker species across the galaxy. They saw humanity as little more than a nuisance, a species too young and weak to stand against the might of their empire. The Dominion had been responsible for the destruction of dozens of lesser species, but until now, humanity had never been in their crosshairs. Rourke's jaw tightened. The Velari had just made the biggest mistake of their existence. There was no more room for negotiation. There was no more waiting for diplomacy to work. His hands balled into fists, and for the first time in years, the old, familiar feeling of war surged within him. This isn't just a colony, Rourke muttered under his breath. This is our people, and we will make them pay. The battle for humanity's survival had just begun. The news of Cyrillus's destruction shook humanity to its core. Across the colonies, from the bustling trade hubs of Earth's orbit to the quiet farming worlds of the Outer Rim, a collective grief settled like a heavy cloud. Yet, for Admiral Elias Rourke, the grief was more than just personal. It was a call to arms. His mind raced through memories of Cyrillus, the smell of fresh soil on terraformed fields, the sound of children laughing in the streets, the gleam of clean, towering spires reaching up from fertile land. All of it gone. Rourke sat in his private quarters aboard the Eagle's Strike, his flagship, staring at the swirling void of space. His fingers hovered over the comm console, hesitant. He could already hear the voices of the Terran Council in his mind. There would be cries for peace. There would be demands for diplomacy. They would want proof. They would want talks. Rourke knew better. He had spent too many years in the military, climbing the ranks, watching humanity stumble and fall in the face of foreign threats. Diplomacy had its place, but it had failed. Cyrillus Prime was evidence enough. The Velari Dominion had shown humanity what they were capable of. They hadn't just destroyed a colony. They had erased it, as if humanity's existence meant nothing. There could be no negotiating with that kind of power. The sound of the door to his quarters sliding open broke his thoughts. Captain Maya Torres, his most trusted officer, stepped inside. Her expression was stoic, but Rourke saw the edge of her own grief in her eyes. "Admiral," she began, her voice calm but firm. "The Council has been calling. They want to know what our next move is." Rourke's eyes narrowed, and he stood from his chair, turning to face her. "Tell them we have no more time for talks." Maya hesitated, a flicker of concern crossing her features. "You're suggesting we go to war." "I'm suggesting we end this," Rourke replied, his voice hardening with each word. "The Velari erased our people. Now we erase their empire." Maya studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll get the message to Fleet Command. You know what this means, don't you?" "I do," Rourke said, his voice grim. "But this isn't about war. It's about justice." Maya turned and left the room, leaving Rourke alone once again. His mind turned back to Sorellis. The memory of the colony, its streets empty and its cities reduced to ash, filled him with a renewed fury. He had watched too many of his brothers and sisters fall in battles that had no meaning. But this would not be one of those wars. This time, humanity would not just fight to survive. They would fight to win. Fleet Command had approved Project Iron Tempest, an initiative that had been under development in secret for years. It would be the most advanced, covert military operation in human history. Rourke had already secured the backing of key officials. Their mission was simple: find the heart of the Velari Dominion, strike it with precision, and dismantle it piece by piece. It would be humanity's reckoning, and there would be no turning back, no compromise, no peace. He walked over to the comm console and punched in the coordinates for the next phase of the plan. It was time. "Set course for the Velari border," he said, speaking to the ship's eye. "We're not waiting any longer." As the ship's engines hummed to life, Rourke stood tall. The path ahead was unclear, and the stakes higher than ever. But he was no longer just an admiral. He was the embodiment of humanity's will. And nothing, not even the ancient might of the Velari, would stop him now. For Sorellis, for the future, for the reckoning. The Velari Dominion had existed for millennia, their empire stretching across dozens of star systems, built on a foundation of conquest and ruthless control. They saw themselves as the unquestioned masters of the galaxy, an ancient race whose superiority was etched into the very fabric of their society. They believed they were destined to rule, not by negotiation or diplomacy, but by sheer force. Humanity had been little more than a nuisance, a young species with no understanding of true power. Until now. Sartel Dren, a rising star in the Velari military, had long been a loyal servant of the Dominion. Born and raised in the spires of Velarth Prime, he had learned the ways of war, command, and strategy from the finest minds in the Empire. He had crushed rebellions, silenced uprisings, and pacified countless species that had dared to challenge Velari might. In his youth, he had believed the propaganda, that the Velari were the galaxy's rightful rulers, and all others were simply there to serve. But now, as he stood in the war room of the Velari High Command, watching the holoprojectors display the recent images of the destruction on Sorellis Prime, a disturbing thought began to gnaw at him. The Terran response had been swift, far faster than the Dominion had anticipated. It wasn't just the destruction of a colony. It was something more. Humans didn't just fight to survive. They fought to revenge. They fought to remember. The message they broadcasted across the galaxy wasn't one of surrender, but of defiance. Sartel had watched the same broadcast repeated over and over. For Sorellis, it echoed in his mind long after the screen had gone dark. The Velari leadership was arrogant, dismissing humanity's potential as nothing more than a fleeting moment in galactic history. They had underestimated the strength of the human spirit. And now, The consequences were unfolding before them. The Dominion had made a grave mistake. The destruction of Sorellis Prime wasn't just an attack on one colony. It was an attack on something far deeper, the unity of humanity. Sartell paced the length of the command room, his mind racing. His superior officers were already speaking of retaliation, of further strikes to subdue the Terran threat. The high generals were eager to assert dominance, to show the galaxy that no one could challenge the Velari Empire and survive. But Sartell felt a growing unease. Something had shifted in the balance of power. The humans were not like the others they had conquered. They weren't simply fighting for their survival. They were fighting for something greater. And that was dangerous. That was the kind of fire that could ignite an inferno. A voice broke his thoughts. Strategist Dren. General Ulker's voice rang through the chamber, deep and commanding. What is your analysis of the situation? Sartell hesitated before responding. The Terrans are not acting out of desperation. They're organized. They're coordinated. And they're more resourceful than we thought. We should consider a different strategy. Ulker scoffed. And what would you suggest? We allow them to strike first. We've dealt with insurgents and rebellions before, Dren. This is no different. But Sartell wasn't so sure. He had watched their fleet movements, their communications, their tactics. The humans were unpredictable. And unpredictability, in his experience, was a trait that no amount of military might could easily overcome. I recommend we reevaluate our approach, Sartell said quietly. Before we continue, we need to understand how they think. They're not following our rules. And that makes them more dangerous than any enemy we faced. The room fell silent. Ulker's expression darkened, but Sartell knew he had planted the seed of doubt. The Velari were still accustomed to their dominance, their overwhelming power, and yet there was something about this conflict, something about the Terrans, that felt different, something Sartell couldn't ignore. And as he stood there, facing the might of an empire that had crushed countless civilizations, he couldn't help but wonder if the Velari had made a mistake that even their centuries of experience couldn't undo. The Velari Dominion had never experienced anything like the precision strike that came from the Terran fleet. For all their might, their belief in invulnerability had made them arrogant. Now, they were paying the price for underestimating humanity. The attack began not with an explosion or a massive military invasion, but with something far subtler. A surgical blow to the Dominion's greatest asset, their communications network. The Velari Nexus, a vast web of advanced quantum communication channels, was the beating heart of the Empire. It allowed the Velari to maintain control over their far-flung worlds, sending commands and orders with lightning speed. It was their crown jewel, untouchable and unassailable. Until now. Under the command of Admiral Rourke, Fleet Phantom, a covert Terran operation designed for stealth, launched a strike that cut the Velari Nexus into pieces. The first wave of ships, small, agile, and nearly invisible to Velari sensors, slipped through the gaps in the Dominion's defenses. They deployed specialized pulse disruptors, which scrambled the quantum channels that connected the Velari's most vital systems. In an instant, entire sectors of the Dominion's infrastructure were cut off from each other. The Velari had no way of communicating across their empire, no way of issuing orders. It was a masterstroke. The first Velari worlds to experience the disruption were the ones closest to the Terran border. Entire fleets were suddenly isolated, their commanders unable to coordinate with each other. Supply lines were severed, and garrisons were left without support. But what struck terror into the Dominion's heart wasn't just the crippling of their military. It was the realization that the Terrans could do this again, and again, at will. Admiral Rourke's message, broadcast across every surviving Velari frequency, was as simple as it was chilling. For Sorellis. The words rippled across the galaxy like a wave, crashing over the Velari as their empire buckled under the weight of its own arrogance. The message was not just a statement of revenge, but a declaration of intent. Humanity wasn't just fighting for survival. They were making a statement that would echo across the stars. The destruction of Cyrillus Prime was not forgotten. Not by the Terrans. Not by anyone. On Velarth Prime, the Velari leadership scrambled to regroup. General Yulker, the architect of the Dominion's military superiority, stood in the war room, staring at the chaos unfolding in real time. Ships were lost, planets cut off, and their communication system was in disarray. His anger was palpable, but beneath it, a growing sense of dread began to seep in. The humans weren't just attacking. They were dismantling. They weren't targeting military installations. They were targeting the heart of the Dominion, exposing its weaknesses. Ulker turned to Sartell Dren, who had been unusually quiet since the strike. Sartell had been warning the Velari leadership about humanity's potential, but now it was clear that his concerns had been valid. The Terrans had taken the fight directly to the Velari, and it wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a war for the future. "What do you suggest, Strategist Dren?" Ulker barked. "We've lost control of key systems. What now?" Sartell's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the damage. His mind was already working, calculating, evaluating. He could see the gaps in their strategy, the vulnerabilities that had been exposed. This wasn't just a Terran attack. It was a war of attrition, a slow but methodical dismantling of the Dominion's power. "We need to think differently," Sartell said, his voice steady. "We cannot afford to fight them in the traditional sense. These humans are unpredictable. They fight in ways we don't understand. If we continue to rely on brute force, we'll lose. We need to isolate them. We need to break their resolve." Ulker scowled, his anger still boiling. "Are you suggesting we back down?" "No," Sartell replied, his gaze unwavering. "I'm suggesting we play their game. We show them we can fight on their terms, and we make them understand what happens when you challenge the Dominion." But deep down, Sartell knew the truth. The Velari Dominion, with all its ancient power, was on the edge of something they hadn't faced in centuries. A species that didn't just fight to win, but fought to remember, to carve their place in the galaxy, no matter the cost. The question was no longer whether the Velari could defeat humanity. The real question was how much of the Dominion would remain when the fight was over. The Velari had always prided themselves on their unmatched military prowess, their iron grip on the galaxy a symbol of their superiority. But now, something far more unsettling had begun to happen. The humans, once considered weak and scattered, were beginning to hit the Velari where it hurt the most. It wasn't the grand space battles or the massive fleets that sent the most fear through the Dominion. It was the quiet, precise, and deadly efficiency of humanity's new tactics. On Caloran, a cold, barren world near the Velari home systems, the first signs of humanity's new strategy emerged. The Velari had deployed a significant garrison, expecting to crush any resistance that might arise. They believed the barren landscape would be perfect for a controlled occupation. No resources to fight for, no cities to defend. They believed they could wipe out any Terran forces with ease, but they had underestimated the Terran survivors of Cyrillus. The Valkyries, the elite Terran shock troops in heavily armored combat exosuits, were deployed under the cover of darkness. Silent, like shadows, they moved through the icy landscape, their thermal vision locking onto the Velari positions. The soldiers inside the suits were survivors from the colonies destroyed by the Velari. Families, engineers, and soldiers who had lost everything. They were no longer just warriors. They were the embodiment of vengeance, and they were more than willing to make the Velari pay. The first wave was swift, almost surgical. The Velari garrisons never saw them coming. The Valkyries struck at critical points, disabling the Velari's communications and power grids before they could react. The battle was one-sided, with the Velari caught completely off guard. They fought back, of course, but the humans were like ghosts, always one step ahead, always moving with deadly precision. The most chilling part, the Valkyries didn't need to engage in brutal firefights. The Velari garrisons were equipped with advanced tech, but it didn't matter. The Valkyries employed tactics the Velari had never seen before. Guerrilla warfare in the snow and ice, silent takedowns, and overwhelming surprise. The humans were relentless, striking where the Velari were weakest. Within hours, the Velari were in full retreat, their once pristine garrison turned into a shattered remnant of a failed occupation. The survivors, those few who managed to escape, spoke of ghosts that haunted the battlefield, soldiers they never saw until it was too late. Terran forces had no regard for the conventional rules of war. They fought with a fire that burned through every mistake they had ever made. But it wasn't just the Velari who were affected by the attack on Kaloran. Across the Velari Dominion, news of the defeat spread quickly. The Dominion had always seen itself as the unchallenged power of the galaxy, its strength unassailable. But now, it seemed, even their most hardened soldiers were no match for the human fire that burned within these new warriors. In the council halls of Velarth Prime, a sense of unease took root. The generals, who had long dismissed humanity as inferior, were now questioning everything they had assumed about their enemies. If the Terrans could strike like this on a frozen wasteland, how many other worlds were they ready to burn with this same vengeance? The fear wasn't just that humanity had become a formidable military power. It was the realization that they weren't fighting for land or riches or any traditional spoils of war. They were fighting for something far more dangerous: justice. And that kind of fire could not be easily extinguished. General Ulker, his face dark with frustration, slammed his fist onto the table. We've underestimated them. They're everywhere. They've taken out entire convoys, wiped out our fleets. They're playing a game we don't understand. Strategist Dren, who had been quiet throughout the discussions, finally spoke. You don't understand because you are still thinking like we're fighting another species. The humans are different. They're not playing by our rules. They're playing by their own. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The room fell silent. The once unshakable confidence of the Velari Dominion was now beginning to crack. Sartell's analysis had been right. The humans weren't merely reacting to the destruction of their colonies. They were waging a war of meaning, a war to prove that even the smallest flame, if it burns bright enough, can melt the strongest of fortresses. We can't fight them as we would any other species, Sartell continued, his voice low but filled with the certainty of someone who had seen the inevitable unfold. We have to adapt, or we will burn like Kaloran. The message from Kaloran was clear, and it had reached the heart of the Velari Dominion like a hammer blow. A critical failure. A garrison lost to a single, swift assault. The humans had made their mark, not with overwhelming force, but with precision, audacity, and most chilling of all, purpose. Admiral Rourke stood in the command center of the Eagle's strike, staring at the latest intelligence reports. The Valkyries' mission had been a success beyond anyone's expectations. The Velari, for all their technological superiority, had been caught off guard, and now their confidence was shaken. They no longer had the same arrogance they'd displayed before Sorellis. They had underestimated humanity, and it was a mistake they would not easily recover from. The Terran fleet had begun a new phase of operations. There would be no grand speeches, no desperate cries for revenge. This was methodical, a slow and deliberate dismantling of the Velari war machine. Every world they touched, every system they attacked, was left in ruins. But it was more than just military strikes. The human fleet was targeting the very foundations of Velari power. Admiral, Captain Maya Torres said, entering the room with a digital tablet in hand. We've intercepted communications from Velarth Prime. The Dominion is moving to deploy their primary fleet. It looks like they intend to retaliate in full force. Rourke nodded, his expression unyielding. They're desperate. This is their final play. They'll send everything they have left. But it won't be enough. His words hung in the air, but there was no doubt in his mind. The Terran fleet had already proven their capabilities. The Velari might have more ships, more firepower, but they lacked the unity, the unbreakable spirit that defined humanity. For the first time, Rourke felt the weight of his responsibility lift, replaced by something far more powerful, the burning need to finish what had been started, to destroy the Velari threat once and for all. "Prepare the fleet," Rourke said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "We move on their capital. We end this now." Captain Torres didn't need to be told twice. She turned on her heel and left the room, relaying the orders to the rest of the fleet. Within minutes, the Eagle's strike was setting course for Velarth Prime, the Velari homeworld, the heart of the empire that had brought death to Sorellis. Back on Velarth Prime, General Ulker was pacing in the war room, his mind spinning. His initial rage had turned into something far more dangerous. Fear. The loss of Caloran had been only the beginning. The Dominion was still reeling from the damage done to its infrastructure. Internal communications were a mess. Their fleets were disorganized, scattered across the galaxy without the coordination they had once prided themselves on. "We can still win this," Ulker muttered to himself. But there was no one left to argue with him. His senior officers had already given up their optimism. The truth was clear. The Dominion was faltering. They were out of options. Strategist Sartel Dren stood silently in the corner of the room, his eyes watching the unfolding crisis with a mixture of calculation and resignation. He had been right all along. The Velari couldn't defeat the Terrans with sheer might alone. They were too unpredictable, too driven by a cause that no empire could truly understand. Humanity had taken the fight to them, not as a desperate bid for survival, but as a war for justice, and that kind of fight was one the Dominion was never prepared for. "We cannot defeat them by force alone." Sartel finally spoke, breaking the silence. "We need a new plan, a way to break their resolve." Ulker glanced at him, his expression tight with frustration. "And what exactly do you propose?" "We've already lost the initiative." Sartel's gaze turned cold, his mind racing. He didn't have a foolproof plan, but he had something far more important: insight. He had studied the Terrans, understood the depths of their resolve. He knew what they valued, and if he could exploit that weakness, perhaps they could still hold on. The humans fight for something greater than territory. They fight for their people, their history. If we can threaten what they value most, we might still turn the tide. Sartel's voice dropped to a whisper, as if the words themselves were too dangerous to speak. "We go after their heart." Ulker's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Sartel saw the glimmer of something in his superior's gaze, a reluctant understanding. "We attack Earth," Ulker said, a cold, grim finality in his tone. "Everything else has failed. Now we go for the core." Sartel nodded. It was a dangerous gamble, one that could shift the course of the entire war. But it was the only move left to them. And as Velarth Prime prepared for its final strike, the fate of two empires and their people hung in the balance. The plan was set in motion, and both sides knew that the final chapter of this war was about to unfold. The Dominion had made its move, a strike at the heart of humanity, Earth itself. They would not merely fight for victory in the stars. They would bring the fight to the cradle of humankind. And it was a decision born of desperation. The Velari leadership had accepted one harsh truth: they were losing, and if they could not break humanity's spirit now, the galaxy would belong to the Terrans. On Earth, Admiral Rourke stood on the bridge of the Eagle's strike, gazing out at the vast expanse of stars. The Terran fleet, an armada of battle-hardened ships, was primed and ready. After weeks of relentless strikes, Rourke had achieved a hard-won peace of mind. They were ready, but still something gnawed at him, a sense of foreboding he couldn't shake. "Admiral," Captain Torres said, her voice cutting through the quiet tension, "we've just received word. The Velari have mobilized their final fleet. They're heading toward Earth." Rourke turned toward her, his expression unflinching. "This is it, then," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The Velari had sent everything they had, every remaining warship, every last fighter, and they were on a direct collision course with the heart of human civilization. His thoughts flickered briefly to the families on Earth, to the billions of souls who had lived in peace until the Dominion's attack. Humanity had fought back with fire and vengeance, but this was the final test. Could they withstand the full might of the Velari Empire? Would they break under the pressure, or would they, like the Valkyries on Caloran, rise once again and prove their strength? "We won't let them reach Earth," Rourke said, his voice steely with resolve. "Prepare the fleet for a full-scale defense, every ship, every fighter. This is our last stand." Torres nodded, her face grim but resolute. "Aye, Admiral. All stations are ready. The fleets are in position." As the Eagle's strike moved into position, Rourke's mind went back to the very first battle, to Sorellis Prime. The burning memory of that day, the destruction of a peaceful colony, the lives lost, the faces of those who had perished, it was all seared into his mind. Humanity had been pushed to the brink, but what the Dominion had never understood was that pushing a species to the edge didn't destroy it. It made it stronger. And so, Earth stood ready. The humans would fight for their homes, their families, and their history. They would fight as they always had, not with an eye for conquest, but with a fierce will to protect everything they had built. Meanwhile, on Velarth Prime, General Ulker paced the command room, his mind racing as he prepared to launch the final offensive. The Dominion's fleet had assembled, a massive force of dreadnoughts and warships, each one more powerful than the last. His orders were simple: break Earth's defenses and strike at the heart of humanity's resolve. But Ulker knew that it would not be easy. The humans had proven themselves far more resourceful than he'd anticipated. Their fleets were scattered, yet they seemed to appear everywhere, always ready to strike back. He was beginning to understand why Sartell had been so insistent on studying the humans. They didn't fight like any other species he had ever encountered. And then there was the human spirit, something he still struggled to comprehend. The Velari had conquered countless worlds, but this war had been different. It wasn't just about land or resources. It was about something far deeper, something the Velari could never truly grasp. The humans didn't just defend their planets. They defended their way of life, their culture, their legacy. In the final hours before the attack, Sartell Dren met with Ulker in the war room, his expression one of quiet determination. The battle would soon begin, and they had one last chance to tip the scales in their favor. Sartell had long warned that the Dominion's greatest strength, its overwhelming military power, could only take them so far. They had underestimated the strength of humanity's will, and now they were about to face the consequences. "This is it," Sartell said quietly, looking over the strategic displays. "The humans will fight for everything they have. We need to make sure we're prepared for what they throw at us." Ulker stared at the holographic battlefield, his fingers twitching with anticipation. "They've thrown everything at us already. They've proven they can't be broken." "Not yet," Sartell replied, his voice barely a whisper. "But they'll break. Everyone has a limit." As the Velari fleet began to move out of the outer rim, heading toward Earth's orbit, Ulker's mind was clouded with doubt. But it was too late now. The final battle was upon them, and in the distance, the Eagle's strike and the Terran fleet prepared for a fight that would determine the fate of two civilizations. The battle for Earth was upon them, and the final act of the war had begun. The skies above the blue planet were filled with ships, both human and Velari, a furious storm of steel and fire. It wasn't just a war of fleets anymore. This was a war for survival, for the future of two races, each fighting for their very existence in a galaxy that had grown weary of conquest. Admiral Rourke stood at the command center of the Eagle's strike, his eyes locked on the vast display before him. The Velari fleet loomed, massive and intimidating, a shadow over Earth's fragile atmosphere. But Rourke's resolve had never been stronger. There was no turning back now. Earth was not just a planet. It was the home of his people, the birthplace of everything they had fought for. It was the one thing the Velari could never understand. humanity's ability to unite when everything else seemed lost. "Admiral, the Velari fleet is in position," Captain Torres reported, her voice tense but steady. "They're deploying their assault ships and preparing to breach the outer defenses." Rourke nodded, not a hint of fear in his demeanor. "Engage at will. Let's make them regret coming here." The Terran fleet, though outnumbered, was determined. Their strategy wasn't just about firepower. It was about fighting with everything they had. The Velari might have the numbers, but humanity had something far more dangerous: the heart of a species unwilling to bow to any conqueror. As the first wave of Velari ships closed in, the Terran defenses ignited. The outer ring of planetary defenses, once a mere deterrent, now became a fortress of fire. Missile batteries and plasma cannons erupted from Earth's surface, sending waves of destruction into the oncoming Velari fleet. The battle was violent, chaotic, and personal. Every shot fired was a reminder of the lives lost, of the colonies destroyed, of the people who had been erased. The Velari hadn't just attacked a species, they had attacked humanity's very essence. Inside the Eagle's strike, Rourke watched as the battle unfolded, each moment a testament to the resilience of his people. Ships exploded in fiery blossoms, debris scattered across the sky like shattered glass. But the Terran fleet held strong, pushing back the Velari's advance, one strike at a time. "Admiral, the Velari flagship is coming into range," Torres said urgently. "They're sending everything at us. We need to take it out now." Rourke's eyes narrowed. This was it, the heart of the Velari fleet, their pride and their command center. Destroying it would cripple their forces and shatter their resolve. He couldn't afford to hesitate. "Target their core reactors," Rourke ordered. "All guns, fire at will." The Eagle's strike and its supporting ships opened fire, a torrent of energy slamming into the Velari flagship. The Velari flagship, the dreadnought Imperium, shook under the barrage, its shields flickering as it retaliated with its own devastating firepower. The battle had come to a head, a clash of titans that would decide everything. On Villarth Prime, General Ulker watched in disbelief as the Velari forces faltered. Their flagship was under siege, and the once proud fleet was being torn apart by the relentless human defense. Despite their technological superiority, despite their numbers, the Velari had underestimated humanity's will to survive. Sartel Dren stood next to him, his eyes scanning the battlefield. "It's over," he said quietly. "We've failed. The humans are too strong. They're too determined." Wolker's face twisted in fury. "No, we will not surrender. We will fight to the last ship." But Sartel, the voice of reason, could see the writing on the wall. The Velari had fought with everything they had, and still it wasn't enough. The human spirit, unyielding, relentless, was something no army could defeat. Back in the heart of the battle, Rourke felt the tide of the war shift. The dreadnought Imperium was beginning to break apart. Its core reactor, overloaded with energy, erupted in a catastrophic explosion. The shockwave rippled through the battlefield, sending debris and wreckage in all directions. It was the turning point the Terran fleet had been waiting for. The remaining Velari forces began to retreat, their once imposing fleet crumbling in the face of humanity's unstoppable drive. The battle had been won. The Velari Empire, once the supreme power in the galaxy, was in disarray. As the last of the Velari ships fled, Rourke allowed himself a moment of relief. They had done it. They had avenged Sorellis. They had saved Earth. And most of all, they had shown the galaxy that no matter the odds, humanity would never be erased. "We've won," Rourke said softly, his voice a mix of triumph and quiet sorrow. "But the war is never truly over." The remnants of the Velari Empire would retreat into the shadows, nursing their wounds and licking their pride. But they would remember what happened here today, how humanity had risen from the ashes of their own destruction and brought down an empire. The story of the human colony they had erased would not be forgotten. And the Velari would learn, too late, that when they erased a human colony, they had inadvertently forged the greatest weapon the galaxy had ever known: the unbreakable will of humanity.